Good afternoon, both to the people here and the people on the other side of this device. My name is Larry Rosenthal. I run the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. We are sponsoring this event along with the Criminal Law and Justice Center at Berkeley Law. I'd like to ask people to silence or otherwise trash their phones. For people on the Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature to ask questions. At the end, there will be questions from both the live audience and Zoom. Today, we're going to discuss the recent publication by Mike German of Policing White Supremacy. I'm delighted to have Mike here and Chesa Boudin as well. Chesa is the co-moderator for today's event. He is a former San Francisco district attorney and the director of the Criminal Law and Justice Center at Berkeley Law. Today's format is going to be that Chesa and I are going to engage Mike German in an open discussion of his book for about 40 minutes, and then we'll turn things over to questions from you all. Okay, with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Mike German, a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. He's also one of the extraordinarily few people to make a second appearance at the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, which
means I'm old.
Yeah, that's it's getting around these days.
Yes.
Okay, and okay, Mike previously served 16 years as a special agent in the FBI, which included 2 domestic terrorism undercover operations against white supremacist and far-right militant groups. Mike resigned in 2004 to raise concerns regarding continued failures in the FBI's counterterrorism program. He is the author of Thinking Like a Terrorist, Insights of an FBI Undercover Agent, and Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, How the New FBI Damages Democracy. Today we are going to talk about his latest book, Policing White Supremacy, The Enemy Within, which was written with Beth Zasloff. And with that, Chesa, you can begin.
Well, thank you for co-hosting this event. Thank you, Mike, for joining us, for your book, and maybe most importantly, for the lifetime of service that you've offered to the country, and not just in the traditional sense of offering service, but more broadly in terms of the ongoing intellectual and policy advocacy work that you continue to do. I'm thrilled to be able to co-host this event. Before I ask Mike our opening kind of question to start the conversation, I want to just disclose that I've been a big fan of Mike personally and of his work since I was in law school well over a decade ago, when I very fortuitously got to crash a lunch he was hosting in Washington, D.C., and have kind of been following his career ever since. I was also similarly lucky to get to read an advanced copy of this book. I know that not everybody here has yet bought a copy for themselves and all of their friends and family. I know that not everybody's had a chance to read the book. So I want to just kind of start by grounding the conversation, making sure we're all on the same page, by asking you, Mike, if you can tell us a little bit about what the book says and why you chose to write it now.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chesa, and thank you, Larry, for inviting me, and thank all of you for coming out. I have been looking at the problem of white supremacy and specifically white supremacist violence for 3 decades. Again, I'm old. From a lot of different angles. You know, initially as a young FBI agent asked to go undercover, investigating criminal acts by white supremacist groups and far-right militias. Then as I aged in the FBI, you know, helping others set up these cases and helping them better understand how these groups worked. You know, one of the surprising things to me when I started, I had only 4 years on the job and I'd only worked white collar crime cases. So when they had first started using me undercover, headquarters kind of went, hey, wait a minute, you know, you got this kid fresh out of law school and now you're throwing him in with a bunch of neo-Nazis. You know, is that really a smart thing to do? And I said, well, you know, I learned torts in a year. I can learn white supremacy, you know, just set me up with the FBI expert. And there was silence. And finally, when, you know, Joker in the back said, well, if you live through this, you'll be the expert. And it was, you know, kind of funny and kind of empowering, right? That, oh my gosh, you know, I get to be the FBI's expert. Of course, the FBI had infiltrated neo-Nazi groups before. I ended up later on meeting agents who were undercover at the time and could have been helping me. But there, you know, even in the FBI, there was a complete misunderstanding about how the criminal groups operate within the movement, but also how to best tackle them, but even how the FBI does it. You know, it was just atomized within the bureau. And part of my coming out of the FBI was because the way that they had explained the failures of 9/11 was not accurate, right? They said there was a lack of actionable intelligence. That was the code term at the time. So, you know, Congress and the Attorney General, we need more powers. We need the Patriot Act. We need all these things. When the real problem that we found out later, when the 9/11 Commission finished their report that was, you know, over 400 pages, that there was a lot of information that the FBI had. But again, the right hand didn't know what the left hand knew. I think Sandy Berger, a former White House National Security advisor, said it correct, that, you know, that the problem with the FBI isn't what it doesn't know, it's that it doesn't know what it does know. And I knew that all these new collection tactics would then make it much more harder to manage the intelligence, right? If your problem is an intelligence management system that's broken, getting more information through these brand new collection mechanisms wasn't going to help. And it happened to be over another investigation I was being asked to work undercover in that I left because it was being mishandled. So I thought I was kind of out of white supremacy. I started doing legal policy work on national security issues and you know, law enforcement and intelligence reform. But in 2015, you might remember there was a shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. A white supremacist went into the Mother Emanuel AME church and shot, and I think it was 9 parishioners, including the pastor who was a sitting state legislator at the time. And Jim Comey, the FBI director, came out and said, I don't think this is terrorism because I don't see any political motive, right? Which is astonishing, but I think was reflective of the institutional bias against viewing white supremacist violence as a national security threat, right? That they're more concerned about organizing by groups that are protesting for social change to actually change the system than they are about white supremacist violence that tends to reinforce existing systems. And so I started writing a number of reports for the Brennan Center, and those reports led to testimonies, and my publisher came to me and said, you know, put all this together, you probably have a book. So we wrote a couple new chapters, and Beth Zasloff came in and assisted me in compiling some of the other things that I wrote. But it's clearly, in many ways, the arguments are much easier now because it's a lot easier to see how the violent white supremacist groups are not actually extremists, as they're often called, that they're much more incorporated into our government systems, and the ideologies that motivate them are held by people in high office. And in order to properly police it, you really have to understand how the violent fringe works hand in glove with government officials. And that's particularly law enforcement, who often either sympathize with these groups or at least reinforce the same social caste and racial caste that white supremacists are targeting. So that's why I wrote the book, to hopefully help, number one, law enforcement to understand the tactics, but number two, just for society to understand why police seem to have such a difficult time addressing this kind of violence.
Well, thank you. And thank you for writing the book. The book is quite extraordinary. The level of research that's gone into this book is what was really remarkable, and the capacity to bring together observations and facts from a lot of different sources is something that anybody who writes a book go, oh my goodness, look what he did. And in the book, Mike goes through the history of of white supremacist actions and the responses, and comes up regularly throughout the book with suggestions, very, very well argued suggestions of what needs to be done institutionally to address these questions. And as he suggested earlier, the reluctance of the of various American administrations to move from defining terrorism and threats as something that came, especially after 9/11, from abroad, and to look at the American right has been an extraordinary struggle, and one that is not looking good in the near future. But I've already suggested to Mike that I read the book, and I felt like in the spirit of the elephant in the room, that there was an elephant over my shoulder reading it, and the elephant was the new administration. So what in Mike's book, there's he generates all sorts of arguments for how to deal with institutionally with the extreme right, and so, for example, one section or one chapter is called "Focusing the FBI." Kash Patel was confirmed this afternoon as the new head of the FBI. In short, so many of the things that emerge from Mike's analysis, the elephant over my shoulder said, "Now what?" And so I would like to pose that as a question for Mike, and in particular, I'm interested in the question of the American militias, and Mike does talk about the Department of Justice going after the January 6th crowd, the January 6th crowd is now, you know, free. And their connections to this administration seem rather straightforward. Let me just say one last thing. I have been thinking about how their presence will be influential and in many ways frightening in the next few years. Um, Today or yesterday in Vanity Fair, um, there was a report which says about Tom Tillis, who voted for Pete Hegseth after saying, "I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it." This is what they say. They're scared shitless about death threats and Gestapo-like stuff. A former member of Trump's first administration says. Senator Tom Tillis told people that the FBI warned him about credible death threats when he was considering voting against Pete Hegseth's nomination for defense secretary. So I would like to open up the question of the militias, the established militias, Trump's relationship to them. I wrote an article years ago in which I called Trump the commandante of the American militias. What can we expect, and where do you think their focus will be?
Thanks for that question. And just by way of explanation, the book was written, but my employment contract with the FBI requires that I submit any books that I write that mention my FBI service to make sure that I'm not saying anything classified. As Larry mentioned, I've written 2 other books and never had so much as a word because, number one, I didn't do much classified work, almost none. And number 2, I don't have any interest in exposing any national security secrets, so it's not what I write about. But when I submitted it in November of 2023, the FBI regulation says they should do it in 30 days. They sent me a note, said, we're not going to be able to look at this for 11 months. Not we're going to be finished looking at it 11 months. We're not going to look at it for 11 months, which would have put it right after the election. And so I had to get my congressman involved and get them to get it out, but it was too late to come out before the election. So I didn't know who was going to win when the last bit of writing was done on the book. And you're absolutely right. I think the reforms I should suggest for the FBI and Department of Justice will work now, will work 5 years from now, will work 10 years from now. So if we ever get back to a place where the FBI is functioning and wants to actually reform, there will be opportunities in the book that I hope are lasting. But it's certainly a different environment now where the pardon sent a very clear message to far-right militants that so long as they operate against Trump's enemies, they will have immunity from prosecution. But more important, it sent a message to law enforcement that even that any effort you spend investigating these crimes will be for naught. And so an institution that was reluctant to investigate these cases anyway is now going to be even more inhibited from doing it. I kind of look at this era, as I did during the Trump administration, as an opportunity to do the reverse of the civil rights era, right? Where state governments were impeding on constitutional rights and the federal government came in to protect them, that now it's really going to be up to state governments to resist some of the federal efforts. And, I think the FBI will likely be out of commission for a while. I think the ongoing purge of officials, either that worked on the Trump cases or the January 6 cases, is going to be crippling for the FBI. And so, to the extent that they're now engaging in immigration enforcement, that will, I think, in some ways help shorten or reduce the amount of time they're spending investigating activists, which they've been doing all along, right? That's their interest in monitoring and suppressing activism has been a part of the FBI since the FBI existed, and I think will continue absent the kind of reforms that I talk about in the book, which, as you said, focusing the FBI is actually limiting their authorities, and I would argue that's the same for the police. When there's a security problem, and this, the knee-jerk reaction is more police, more authority for the police, when that's the opposite that you should do. That if they're focused where there is evidence of crime, they would be much more effective. I mean, one of the interesting things that as we've seen the expansion in law enforcement authorities since the 9/11 attacks and the expansion of resources for law enforcement, if you look at clearance rates, they're way down from where they were when violent crime really was a serious social problem in the 1990s. Even though there were far more murders then, they saw a far greater percentage of them. And now murder rate or murder clearance rates are down to close to 50%. Half of the murders are going unsolved, despite all the resources we're putting into law enforcement and have kept putting into law enforcement. So a lot of our notions about how or what the function of law enforcement is, it's not actually accurate to what they do.
Let me follow up on that with first a point and then a question. I mean, on that last point you made, Mike, I want to just emphasize that people are interested in the statistics. In legal scholarship, we put footnotes in like every clause of every sentence. So we're used to having 300 footnotes in an article. I want to give people a reference to back up what Mike just said about the clearance rates. Obviously, every law enforcement jurisdiction is different. And you can look at different categories of crime and different time periods and see different data. But there's some really, really good long-term statistical analysis that's been published over the last couple of years by a nonprofit research center in San Francisco called the Center for Juvenile and Criminal Justice. And their reports are all available online, tend to focus on California. But what they show is exactly what Mike described, that over the last several decades in California, across jurisdictions, although San Francisco is uniquely bad, we've seen the number of reported crimes in most categories plummet to decades lows. We've seen the budgets for police spiral to all-time highs. And we've counterintuitively, because if you have more money and fewer crimes, you would surely expect a higher percentage of rate of cases being solved. We've seen the opposite. We've seen more money, fewer crimes, and fewer crimes being solved. It's hard to explain, although one of the folks who I know is in the audience has done a lot of really good research as part of a team here at Berkeley looking at the potential political motivations for some of the changes in clearance rates. So that research is available as well. My question, though, for you, Mike, is kind of zooming out and thinking historically. I know that in this moment, a lot of us are waking up in the morning, we're doom scrolling the news. I was meeting with a student for coffee before this, and CNN, like every headline that came on was chaotic, was disruptive, was scary. By design, I'm sure that's what the administration is doing. The confirmation of, in some ways, one of the most unlikely FBI directors one could even dream up, is something that I can only imagine you get asked to opine about all the time. What's the future of the Bureau? What does it look like? I want to kind of zoom out and think historically. You mentioned the history of the FBI kind of targeting activists. There is a critique that, again, for folks who want to read about this, sort of a far left critique of the FBI in the 1960s, the COINTELPRO operation. Ward Churchill wrote a book, Agents of Repression, about the FBI. My adoptive mother was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list in the 1970s. My cousin was the subject of an FBI kidnapping plot, an illegal one, to try to find out where my mother was in hiding. So I say that mainly to say there is a long and complicated history of this agency, both helping to protect public safety, and then in some instances, flagrantly violating and flaunting the law. As we think about what lies ahead, how similar or how different is this moment really? Your work, your book, your previous writings make clear that the FBI has been unwilling or unable to take seriously the threat of white supremacist violence. In some ways, that's exactly what we're seeing with the January 6th pardons and with the kinds of people we're now seeing take over the Bureau. Is this really that different? And if so, why and how?
So certainly having Kash Patel as director is very different. First, he's the first person of color ever to lead the FBI. Second, he's the first person to ever have criminal defense and particularly public defender work on his resume. I'm not sure that I can find positives besides that. And it has been frustrating. The Brennan Center has a policy of not commenting on presidential nominations. So I was getting a lot of these questions, but unable to answer them. But certainly, having somebody who has promoted conspiracy theories and talked about targeting political enemies in his book, had a list of specific individuals. That's very dangerous for an FBI director. I think the FBI is like any government institutions, right? There are reform efforts and then reaction to those reforms. And I think the FBI has been somewhat sheltered from reform in many ways. I mean, one of the things I point out is that it's still predominantly a white male organization. If you look at the special agent cadre, they're almost 80% white and 75% male, right? So if you look at the political opinions of white males around the country and then overlay that with the personnel that the FBI hires, and this is even, J. Edgar Hoover was openly racist and misogynist, wouldn't let women in. Only a handful of Black agents were hired in his multi-decade term. So every director since him has been very explicit about diversifying the FBI is an important national security issue, that we can't serve the public if we don't represent the public. And yet they've never actually changed. And I thought, people forget, Christopher Wray was a Trump appointee. Like, everybody was shocked. I was getting these same questions when he resigned. Why would he resign? Why wouldn't he fight? It's like, that you'd ask him to fight against the guy who appointed him. That's probably not in his nature. But I thought the intentionality of the lack of diversification was made clear when he discussed the issue, because every time Congress asked about it, he would always talk about recruitment efforts, right? And he would always say, "We're very happy to say that the pool of applicants we're getting is one of the most diverse we've ever had." Well, the problem was never that people of color didn't want to be in the FBI, that women didn't want to be in the FBI, is that they didn't get through their approval process. And none of that approval process had changed. So, they were picking people who looked like them, picking people that they thought, reflected their values. So that's why they remain that way. And they have antiquated systems like polygraph examinations as screenings, which are junk science, but they rely on them. And I think you're right that in many ways it hasn't changed at all. But what you had during the periods of reform was the reactionaries within the FBI were pushed to the margins. And 9/11 empowered them in a way that I knew was dangerous, which is why I left the FBI, that this element within the FBI got empowered, and it's never really gone back to where it was when I joined, where it really was a period of reform. Not that the FBI wasn't making similar mistakes at that time, but I did feel like, okay, I can join this organization because they've learned from the mistakes of their past, and now we can move forward. But unfortunately, some lessons keep getting unlearned.
Let me try to follow up on that. You're suggesting a kind of alternation between reform and the worst of the offenses that have gone along with racism, institutional racism. I assume you joined in the wake of, I guess, the church committee had
Right.
happened and which addressed COINTELPRO. And you know, my question is, you seem to suggest that there's this alternation
Mm.
between what's the effects of reform and the institutional racism. You seem to suggest that that may continue to be the case.
Mm.
I think that there is a widespread feeling that this is different,
Mhm.
and that what is happening now is an institutionalization of the most extreme right in not only the Cash Patel's FBI, but in agency after agency after agency, should they survive, and and with this relationship with militias on the outside. I was struck by the fact that you very frequently use the word fascists
Mm.
to describe people in the world where I work. I have been historically very chary about
Mhm.
using the word fascist, but in one could say that the defining characteristic of a fascist movement is the marriage between an electoral party and a private militia.
Right.
So the suggestion, of your use of the fascist, of the word fascist, that something fascist-like
Mhm.
is upon us in a way that it's never been before, suggests something institutional that might not have this capacity for alternation that you seem to be suggesting.
Yes, and thank you for that, because I know there's a lot of scholarly debate on when it's appropriate to use a term like fascist, but I was undercover with a lot of people who were openly called themselves fascists and talked about how to work with the government in a way that describes exactly what you're talking about. And so kind of the same way, when Barack Obama was running for president, I was getting all these calls from and people. A lot of people were being more open in their racism. I was getting calls from journalists, and they would say, "Oh, such and such groups, increase in white supremacy, increase." I'm like, increase compared to what? Right? Do you think somebody who wasn't racist 2 years ago decided, boy, now is a good time for me to become racist? Right? That it's just like in the FBI, where the numbers don't change. It's the suppression of those voices in polite society, right? That they didn't change their opinion. They just knew that expressing their opinion out loud brought condemnation. And I think it's kind of the same thing where, the reform effort allowed reformers within the FBI to use the new rules to suppress the people who wanted to do, target groups because they didn't like them. Didn't prevent all of them from doing it, but at least you had something to point to. And that's why I was concerned right when the FBI started changing its rules, because basically the standard that was instituted after the Church Committee investigation, the Attorney General guidelines, required me as an agent to have a reasonable indication that somebody was committing or going to commit a crime, right? That's not very complex, pretty simple. And what I found, particularly working undercover with Nazis, where everybody is saying something I think is horrible and disgusting and dangerous. But if I couldn't write on a piece of paper why this guy was committing a crime, or what evidence I had to believe this person was committing a crime versus this other person, I would have to focus my attention where the evidence led, rather than who was, most flowery in their rhetoric. In a scary way. And so what I found is that was designed not just to protect the civil rights and privacy of people who are just expressing themselves, but also to focus law enforcement, much the way I talk about focusing the FBI, that creating those rules allows the suppression of the bad actors. But after 9/11, when they removed that rule, and now agents right now can target anybody they want for an investigation based on their own assessment that their conduct is designed to prevent crime. In other words, it's no longer your subjective innocence that protects you. It's my subjective belief, or your objective innocence that protects you. It's my subjective belief as an agent that what I'm doing is appropriate, right? It kind of reverses the calculation, and so then it becomes very difficult for a reformer to say, no, you shouldn't investigate that group. This, as I point out in the book, white supremacists kill far more people than any other group that is considered quote unquote extremist, and yet their investigations tend to target groups that haven't killed anybody. That, why are you spending, what I used to tell young agents with the reasonable indication standard, if you can't write down on a piece of paper the evidence you have to suggest this person is doing something wrong, it's not worth the taxpayer's dime for you to be investigating them. That, luckily there are enough bad people out there. As agents, go find somebody that you can actually, make an argument that this person is committing crime. So I don't know whether what's going to come out of the Patel FBI is going to be so much worse than, this isn't brand new, right? I mean, we had the era where the Ku Klux Klan and the police were the same group, right? That this isn't something we haven't seen in this country before, and there are people who would call that era an example of a fascist government in the United States in many places. So, I think if we understand that history and understand what was done to stop that then, or to again reduce it, then the path is a lot easier to how we get back to reform. So I do think that it's important and I'm worried. I'm worried about the future with far right violence being authorized at a high level, and I think at least what Donald Trump doesn't recognize is that giving a green light to political violence is most dangerous, because it's impossible to predict where it comes and who it comes for. And I would just point out that the person who took a shot at candidate Trump was trafficking in the same anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant rhetoric that people who he might think his followers are spreading, right? That who it comes for isn't necessarily, their world isn't a mirror of the mainstream world. They've got different ideas about what's really happening. So mainstream politics don't really appeal to them in many cases. And I think what happened in the first Trump administration And this was fascinating at the time, because when Trump first started coming out with racist remarks about Mexicans committing crimes and things like that, all of a sudden mainstream media started bringing television cameras and microphones to white supremacists, many of whom didn't have any followers until they appeared on a mainstream TV channel as the leader of some group that existed of their cousin and little brother, that now all of a sudden they're becoming prominent. And at first they would say, this guy's not one of us, right? He's a billionaire New Yorker. His daughter's Jewish and his son-in-law is Jewish. He's a big supporter of Israel. What are you coming to us for? He's not part of this. But very quickly, when the cameras kept coming, they flipped and said, oh yeah, of course we support Donald Trump. But it was always Trump exploiting them and them exploiting Trump. And so, I think now is going to be if any of you are thinking of joining a militia, now's not the time to do it. I think it's going to be very hard for them, number one, to reincorporate these people who went to prison for January 6th, because you can imagine you're in an organization you think is doing good things, and your leader leads them into some catastrophe. You spend years rebuilding some structure around it. Now the guy who led you into catastrophe comes out and says, oh, I'm back in charge. Yeah, probably not. Not to mention, there were a lot of trials, a lot of people testified. Turned out a lot of people were informants or had been informants. And that's the kind of thing that in these groups that isn't really looked on very well. So I think there's going to be a lot of strange things in that community for the foreseeable future, and things that, kind of looking at it through a mainstream lens, might seem hard to understand. And I think part of this is where law enforcement gets confused, right? That it doesn't fit their idea of what these groups are, right? That why would we have to protect the Capitol from the Proud Boys? We like the Proud Boys. They wear Blue Lives Matter flags on their, they show up at our rallies, they're part of us. Well, right up until they weren't, right? And so, I think it takes understanding what's really going on, both with these groups and with law enforcement and the government agencies that tend to kind of work hand in glove with them too often.
I want to just, before I ask another question, just do a quick time check. We have about 5 or so more minutes for questions from the panel, and then we're going to open up for questions from the audience. Have we distributed index cards? Maybe now is a good time.
No, the people in the room will raise their
Okay,
hands.
all right,
I have
and
cards
for Zoom. Okay, great. So we'll, for those of you on Zoom, we'll take your questions. They'll get passed up to the front. We'll be able to incorporate those and make sure we get to ask them with Mike. People in the room, get your questions ready. After this next answer from Mike, we'll go ahead and open it up. One of the things that really resonated with me, Mike, in your answer to the last question was this idea about cultural change and the ways in which the kind of pendulum swing in policy and reform can empower or disempower, embolden or kind of cover up what may already be there. It resonated with me in part because I was district attorney during COVID and during a time when Trump was really ratcheting up anti-China and anti-Asian rhetoric, blaming China and the Asian American community for COVID, among other things. And of course, we saw in response to that a surge across the country in anti-Asian hate crimes, hate speech. We saw the spa shooting in Atlanta, where a young white supremacist targeted a bunch of Asian women for a violent killing spree. So it really resonated because I think we see exactly what you described throughout history and in this moment, where it may be there all the time, but people know better than to say the quiet part out loud with a different president. And then Trump really emboldens and creates political space and normalizes certain kinds of otherwise unacceptable, problematic behavior. I want to follow up on that thread, but looking at the FBI as an agency, I learned also as DA just how challenging it can be to change the institutional culture of a law enforcement agency, but really any bureaucracy. I'm sure the same is true of universities and sports teams and what have you, in different ways, but similar. So as we look at the FBI, an organization that you've described in terms of the kinds of people it recruits and retains, the kinds of internal fights or disagreements or blind spots or Achilles heels that it has, I'm sort of struck by something that played out in the national media in law enforcement over the last week or so, where a series of very high-profile U.S. attorneys and assistant U.S. attorneys refused the direction of the Department of Justice to dismiss the criminal case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams and resigned instead of taking that direction.
Right.
I'm curious if you have a sense of how much similar behavior, resignations, high-profile refusals to go along with marching orders, we should expect from within the FBI. And to the extent you're comfortable answering it, if you were an FBI agent today, how would you draw bright lines? How would you decide what is, where is it important for me to stay the course and be ethical and continue doing the critical work of the agency and defend the good parts of the culture? And where would you say, no, this is an order or this is an approach that I simply can't continue to be part of? I'm going to resign, maybe publicly, maybe quietly. To the extent you're comfortable, I know that's a very tricky question. Maybe you don't have time to get to it, but I wanted to tee it up because I think it's something that anybody in government, in any area of federal government today, is probably grappling with.
That's a great question. And, there arguably was a little bit of pushback when the Justice Department first asked the FBI to produce the list of agents who had worked on the January 6 cases and a handful of others. The hand-picked acting director it initially said that he wasn't going to do it. Ultimately capitulated and did it. I don't know what. I mean, in many ways, asking for the list is performative, right? The FBI is part of the Department of Justice. FBI agents, believe it, bureaucracy was our middle name. Right? Your time is recorded, right? You're putting all of your time and attendance into the records by the case number. So they have that at their fingertips anytime. They don't need a list. They can make that list in the electronic data they already collect. So everything with Donald Trump is really hard to understand what is performance and what is policy. The fact that there was a capitulation to this request to produce the list of names is, I think, entirely designed to paralyze the FBI, to make them so afraid, because one of the things you're already seeing from many quarters, but also in the FBI, a lot of these people are Trump supporters who now have to worry about losing their job. But the people who study authoritarianism, that's how it works, right? You don't strike fear by saying, if you do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you'll be safe, because everybody can just do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The punishments are arbitrary, so you're never sure when you're overstepping. So you become paralyzed, that you can't really operate because you're so afraid to do anything that might be perceived as contrary to the authoritarian's wishes. So that's why I think the FBI is going to be in turmoil for some time. I think there probably already are people resigning or retiring just to get out. I was very unusual to come out loud and making a point publicly. It's kind of against the FBI's ethos. What you're trained from day one at the academy is never embarrass the Bureau. When I was learning that, I thought, okay, they don't want me to mess up and embarrass the Bureau. And it's like, no. You can mess up. We'll take care of you for that. You're just not allowed to publicly embarrass the Bureau, whether that's telling true things about internal misconduct or not. So I would be surprised to see a lot of loud resignations, but I imagine that there are already resignations. For me, it was when I was told to lie on a document. And one of the other things you're trained in is the FBI. I wish FBI management kept this mantra was, your whole career is based on you getting up at the stand and telling the truth. And if you're ever caught in a lie, your ability to ever be believed again is so, you always tell the truth, no matter how bad it will affect your prosecution or whatever, you tell the truth. So being told to lie about something was kind of enough for me to say, okay, this isn't what I signed up for. And I think many agents will have that same thing, that, they can go along with a lot that they don't necessarily agree with, but if they're actually fabricating things, then I think we'll see some people leaving. But like I said, I think most of them will leave quietly.
Okay. Let's turn it over to the audience. Take a question from the live audience first, please. In the back. Hold on.
With the new
Wait, 1 minute.
administration.
Wait,
We just
we need people on Zoom to be able to hear as well, so wait for the microphone, please.
Thanks. With the new administration and contrasted perhaps with some of your recommendations for the Bureau, which of your reforms or Bureau improvements would you most expect the Patel FBI to move forward on?
That's a great question. And in case anybody online didn't hear, it's what reforms Patel might implement. One of the concerns that many of the Trump supporters had was the misuse of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And the FBI, this is a secret court that meets to approve wiretaps and searches in a national security context. It's been a flawed system. It was one of the Church Committee reforms was creating this court, because otherwise the FBI was just doing it on its own through the Justice Department. But it's never really worked very well. In the late 90s, there was a scandal where agents were caught not being completely truthful in FISA applications. One agent was told never to come back to that court. It's come up over and over again as FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, was expanded in a program called Section 702. So that program was the approved program after it was discovered the president had set up his own surveillance program just based on his own authority without going to the court. When the New York Times exposed that, Congress created this 702 that allows the NSA, the National Security Agency, to grab international communication so long as they're targeting the person in a foreign country. They can collect US person information, but they weren't supposed to do what are called backdoor searches, where the FBI goes in and searches for Americans in that system of secured calls. So that was a critical program that many Republicans opposed. It just got reauthorized last year, but I would imagine that it's possible that Patel will want to narrow some of those authorities. I think that's probably the best we can hope for is that they'll narrow the use of these Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act authorities.
We have a couple of questions from the online audience. I'm going to, because we have so many, I'm going to try to group them. There's a couple of questions that are following up on something you said earlier, Mike, about the need for local authorities to do more in this political context. It's something, frankly, that resonates with me as a lawyer and an impact litigator. A lot of our kind of community of advocates are thinking about state courts more than federal courts now. So the question that I'm going to combine from a few people is basically, what can local city leaders and local law enforcement do to fill the void, particularly with regard to white supremacists and militias?
Well, I mean, one thing that can be done is much more of an effort needs to be done to make sure that people who have affiliations with white supremacists and militia groups are not serving in law enforcement. And when I talk about this issue with law enforcement leaders, they often say, hey, we can't get into the mind and the heart of every officer. We can't monitor their social media 24/7. How can we do this? And what I tell them is, ask your officers. Your officers know who the racist cops are. Your officers know who the ones are engaging in misconduct are. And if they won't tell you, it's because they get punished, right? Right now, it's safer to engage in racist misconduct as a police officer than it is to report a colleague for engaging in racist misconduct. Safer to your career. So that can change overnight with just leadership directives. Obviously, some better whistleblower protection laws for law enforcement would be a good way to help protect them. But state and local elected leaders can also get involved in that. We have a system because the other people who know who the racist cops are the community, right? They can give you their names, they can point out incidents, and they often do in complaints they make to the police department or to members of Congress, or I'm sorry, members of legislatures where if those elected leaders don't have access to those complaints, they can establish boards that will have access to those complaints, because that's going to be a roadmap to the problem officers. And the problem officers cost taxpayers, right? When they lose these suits or these suits are settled, that's money out of our pocket, not out of their pocket. So that's a way that they can do it, and also hold these agencies responsible. I mean, right now there isn't a government institution that collects objective data on attacks by white supremacists and far right militants. The FBI doesn't collect it. The FBI doesn't know how many people white supremacists kill each year. They don't collect that data. Even though they say counterterrorism is their #1 policy, they don't collect that data. Well, that doesn't mean that the state of California can't collect that data. The state of New York can collect that data. Hate crimes reporting is particularly low, as you know. Part of the problem is the federal government has responsibility for collecting that data, but they leave it up to local law enforcement to collect it without acknowledging that there are some real impediments to state and local enforcement of hate crimes. So what I would suggest to local leaders is to put resources into community systems, restorative justice. That there was a hate crime in San Francisco when you were the DA, that a group helped put together a restorative justice plan. And I think that the hate crime area is a good place to experiment with and utilize these restorative justice, because the police are already leaving a vacuum, right? So there's already a need for it. So investing in those programs is a good idea, but also investing in those programs is an investment in community, right? And what white supremacists and far right militants and the politicians who support them are trying to do is divide communities. And any measure that can be taken to build that social cohesion by empowering community groups to do for themselves, to create systems of public safety that don't involve the police, those are worth investing in.
Hi, thank you so much. I can't wait to read the book. You mentioned NGOs as a solution, community groups. We're also seeing, for instance, the January 4th story that broke an AP about the vigilante, the left-wing vigilante that infiltrated a paramilitary group and has a lot of information about those groups connecting with the Oath Keepers, Super Centers, Proud Boys. I realize that extrajudicial vigilantism is not ideal, but I think considering the lack of support legislatively and in the law enforcement itself, are we going to see an uptick in this vigilantism? Are you already seeing organizing by individual actors infiltrating these groups?
I wouldn't use the term vigilantism for somebody who's not violent, right? If they're just there gathering information and not engaging in violence against this group, I would not use that. I don't know how that would fit in with the scholarly work, but to the extent people,
it's extremely sensible. Bravo.
It's always been the case, right? Communities have always been doing this anti-fascist work, trying to understand these groups. And, that's another resource that local officials should, if somebody had told me, I was shocked when the Trump administration and the Attorney General Barr at the time were so effective in branding anti-fascist as the threat, and that got picked up in the media was shocking to me. That if you're describing your enemy as an anti-fascist, now we get into that word again. You must be labeling yourself as a fascist. And I didn't think any sitting politician would ever be able to do that, but they did it successfully. And to many people in the public, Antifa was this confusing, scary sounding thing that where I talk about it in the book, that most of them are just tracking the crimes these groups are committing in their communities and identifying them when they do harm for the public to know about them, more importantly, but certainly should be a source of intelligence for law enforcement. But again, law enforcement tends to have an antagonistic relationship with those groups, even as they have somewhat sympathetic relationships with the far right groups. So I think it is important for those groups to get supported and not to be denigrated, that we understand what they are. And I'm opposed to using violence, but that kind of work and the work done by researchers at centers that study this stuff is really important, and important both for, I come at it from a perspective of law enforcement, for law enforcement to better understand these groups and the individuals within them, but also for the communities, because again, I think that nothing that I talk about is giving police more power. It's focusing their authorities, narrowing their authorities, so they focus on actual acts of violence rather than targeting groups because they have a quote unquote radical opinion. So yeah, I think that totally should be something that we're supporting.
There's a couple of questions from the Zoom audience that are really kind of dovetail with what we were just talking about. So I'm going to try to combine them. Mike, you were talking about the sort of successful branding of Antifa as the problem. There's a couple of people in the audience who want to know your views about a lot of kind of activist groups or criminal organizations that are often kind of described as terrorists or significant concerns for the FBI. And people are curious, what do you think about, for example, the Mexican drug cartels? Obviously, they exist, they're real, they are responsible for lots of violence. Do they actually qualify as terrorists? And similar question about a very different kind of organization or series of organizations, which are environmental activists, which have been targeted consistently by FBI investigations. And is that appropriate? Any comments on the kind of allocation of resources and the branding that goes into some of these other groups?
Right. So on the targeting of environmentalists, starting about 2004, 2005, the FBI started saying eco-terrorism was the #1 domestic terrorism threat in the country, even though there's not a single homicide related to environmental or animal rights activism. And has since then aggressively targeted these groups. The Intercept has done a lot of great reporting on that. There's a reporter named Adam Fetterman who covers that issue very well. Will Potter wrote a book, Green is the New Red, that talks about that, what he calls the green scare, this idea that environmentalists pose some kind of threat. And to the extent they would point at crimes that the FBI would point at crimes they say are terrorism, they tend to be property crimes. And vandalism and other property destruction is a crime. And certainly that's something that should deserve some law enforcement attention, but it's hard to call that terrorism. And to the extent that you're going to call it terrorism, you need to have some objective template. And what we did, we worked with Congress in 2020. They passed a provision of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020 that required the FBI, because the FBI has these different categories. They had a category for white supremacy, a category for what they called Black separatists. When I was working, they later changed that to Black identity extremists. They had a category for anarchists. They had a category for environmentalists, for animal rights activists, all these different categories. You know, the FBI leaders will often say, our domestic terrorism program doesn't focus on groups or ideologies. It focuses on violence, except that their program is divided by ideology. So, you know, if you're a counterterrorism supervisor, you have to have a case for every category, right? You're not going to have a category and say, yeah, we don't think that's a thing. Right? So it's a way of compelling investigations of those groups. And because those groups aren't active and aren't engaged in crimes, deadly violence that we would call terrorism, they tend to look for other things they're doing and try to find something to justify their investigation. So the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020 worked to codify or document that, right? So it instructed the FBI and Department of Homeland Security to put out reports that list what I call both sides of the ledger. On the one side, by category, the number of domestic terrorism incidents and the number of the fatalities that result. And on the enforcement side, the number of investigations you open, the number of indictments and convictions. And if you had that data, you could see which groups are most active, which groups are most deadly, and which groups the FBI is devoting resources to, and whether those resources result in convictions, right? Because if you have a lot of investigations but very few convictions, maybe you should divert some of those resources to something else. The FBI refused to provide the data. They say they don't collect domestic terrorism incident data, and they don't have data on fatalities. Number one priority of the FBI is counterterrorism, and yet they don't know what incidents count as domestic terrorism or who gets killed by them. I mean, it's really an astonishing statement for them to make. Even more astonishing, the Justice Department can't tell you how many domestic terrorists it prosecutes. It puts out data that suggests there's a number of domestic terrorism prosecutions, but the Brennan Center issued a FOIA request trying to get the docket numbers so we could see what cases they were counting as domestic terrorism. And they were able to keep those hidden by arguing to the judge that not all cases we call domestic terrorism are domestic terrorism. Right, so this, and I believe the resistance to producing this data is an essential part of them wanting to not talk about white supremacist violence and instead focus resources on groups like environmentalists. And I'm sorry, there was another, the first question.
Oh, it was, I mean, it was environmentalist Mexican drug cartels was the other example.
Oh, so this is in the news because the Trump administration is targeting drug cartels as terrorist groups. And, you know, news. We have an entire federal agency devoted to targeting drug cartels.
Oh, the DEA for folks who aren't
right. You know, the idea, you know, and I've heard an argument, well, it's good rhetorically, where I can imagine a drug dealing murderer being really upset that they're also going to call him a terrorist, right? You know, it's kind of, again, you know, is this a performative thing or is there some other intent? You know, certainly the terrorism laws are extremely broad, and the material support for a foreign terrorist group, designated foreign terrorist groups, allow you to target people who aren't involved in the dangerous activity. In other words, not involved in terrorism, but maybe, you know, providing humanitarian aid to a conflict zone, some of the cases. So it certainly could have some dangerous ramifications from it, but there's already plenty of laws to target drug cartels. And, you know, we've been doing it and throwing tremendous resources at it for a long time. And it hasn't, you know, how many blocks would you have to walk to get drugs? My guess is not very many, right? So if it's that ineffective, you know, maybe we just need to find a different solution for that problem.
I think we have time for maybe one more question from the live audience.
We've got lots from the Zoom community, so, or if there's one in the back, take it, but I'm certainly happy to keep going with the questions from the Zoom audience.
Curious, sorry.
Yeah.
Curious about the allocation of resources of FBI agents. I understand that a lot of agents were put onto investigating and closing cases for the January 6th crowd. And that sounds like it's a little bit unusual, particularly with the, is it like a polarization, the embedded preference to maybe support those people? It sounded like each agent might be internally conflicted.
Yeah.
The agency is a little bit confused as well.
Yeah, so, on the one hand, it's the biggest investigation the FBI ever worked at. Over 1,500 people charged with, committing a crime in concert. My criticisms of the approach were that they treated January 6th as if it started that morning, it ended that evening, and that was it, rather than recognizing that a lot of the people involved in that had been committing violence around the country. Some of them had been involved in these groups that were committing, that we call domestic terrorism groups. And there was a Washington Post article that quoted an unnamed law enforcement official that there were dozens of people on the FBI's terrorist watch list in Washington, D.C. that day. Now, how many times do you have dozens of people on a terrorist watch list come together and you don't have a significant law enforcement response to that? So, but I also criticize the decision to charge misdemeanors, and particularly to charge disproportionately charge misdemeanors in the beginning of the case. So for the first 6 months, they were mostly charging people who had come into the Capitol. In fact, they called it the Capitol breach investigation. So they were more focused on people who came into the Capitol who maybe, went in through an open door or window, didn't have any direct interaction with a police officer, walked in, walked out. Why prosecute those people when you have so many people who committed violence against police officers that literally after 4 years, the FBI did not get around to arresting people who had been charged, or I'm sorry, people who had been identified. There were a lot of, as you say, these public groups who volunteered their time and services to pour through the tapes and identify people who were harming police officers. They would publish that and put it out to the FBI, and they just hadn't got around to that yet. So I think the approach to the case reflects some ambiguity about how hard they were really trying to complete those investigations, but the investigations that were done in a way that demonstrated what I have always argued, that it's not a lack of authority. And it was funny, there was a narrative after the Charleston, South Carolina shooting that the reason that the FBI is not more effective at policing white supremacist violence is because there isn't a domestic terrorism statute, right? And this became kind of the narrative in the media that there needs to be a domestic terrorism statute. It was news to me. I worked domestic terrorism cases in the 90s. Nobody suggested we didn't have enough statutes. And even more confounding, because if you open up the US criminal code, there's an entire chapter called terrorism that lists 57 federal crimes of terrorism. I couldn't understand, number one, why these former Justice Department people were saying it, other than that they really didn't know, because they don't use these laws very effectively. Or why the media would keep suggesting that was true when it's not. And I still, doing the tour for the book, running into people, don't they need a big domestic terrorism statute? No, they have more than enough laws. And it became a problem for prosecutors because in detention hearings, they would have to say, this statute is a federal crime of terrorism, So, this is a serious case here. And there was confusion over whether there's a federal crime of terror. Yes, there are a lot of them. 51 that apply just to domestic incidents. So
we have just a few minutes left. I wish I could get to all the questions in front of me. There's some great questions. I want to end, since I think we probably have time for just one more question, with one from the audience, which is a little bit more personal. and it's hopefully one that you can leave us as a group, as an audience, with some inspiration from. The question, and there's a few versions of this that have come in, but is essentially about whether or not you've gotten much pushback. And I think in particular around this book and this moment, but maybe more broadly over the course of your career, you described doing something that's very unusual in the Bureau, of coming out when you left very publicly with your criticisms and concerns. I know you, and I know you well enough to know, as anybody who reads your work, frankly, can see that you do it because of a love for your country and a deeply held belief and abiding conviction that this is how you can advance safety and democracy most effectively. But that doesn't mean you're going to be immune from criticism or pushback or threats, which we talked about earlier today. So can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of pushback you've experienced, and maybe even more importantly, how it is that you've persevered, stayed the course, continued to speak the truth, and what inspires you to go on in a context where a lot of people are preferring to put their head between their legs and run for cover?
So I haven't really received a whole lot of pushback. I've been very fortunate that throughout my advocacy career, even though I often criticize law enforcement, I get invited to speak in closed law enforcement rooms, and you know, they're often very frank conversations, and I certainly have a lot of people who don't like what I say, but you know, like you said, you know, my training as a lawyer, there are a lot of footnotes in there. You know, and what I say in those audiences, look, you know, if you come across something where what I said is wrong, I don't want to say anything wrong, right? So if there's some footnote and I misread the data, let me know and I'll change it. You know, it serves no purpose for me to promote false material. You know, the one that I thought I was going to get pushback on, that a lot of it is in the book. I wrote a report for the Brennan Center called Hidden in Plain Sight, specifically about white supremacy, racism, and far-right militancy inside law enforcement. And I was expecting to get some pushback from that. But really the strongest pushback I got from law enforcement was that it's not as big a problem as I was suggesting. To which I said, okay, what's the acceptable number of white supremacists in law enforcement? You know, is there an acceptable number? I don't want to exaggerate it. I wish, you know, that some official authority would go out and collect that data. That would be very helpful. And, you know, then we can know what's accurate. But you know, the documents I use to rely on my arguments are FBI documents. The FBI warned me when I went undercover that there were people in law enforcement who sympathized with these groups, and they warned the whole task force that we had to be careful about it. And those warnings have since appeared in print. In the FBI's 2015 counterterrorism guide, it specifically warns agents investigating domestic terrorism cases against white supremacists and far-right militants that their subjects, the people they're targeting with their investigation, will often have active links to law enforcement. And it tells them to change their tactics. When the tactics that you use in another terrorism case won't work here. You have to change your tactics because of this problem. And yet they won't acknowledge it publicly. And they don't have any kind of program. In fact, after I wrote that report, the House Oversight Committee had a hearing on white supremacy in law enforcement, asked the FBI to come in to update the reporting. This was in 2020, so 2015 was the last report we had. The FBI disavowed their own intelligence, disavowed the intelligence that their agents and analysts had gone out there and collected, and said it's not a problem. That was 3 months before the attack on the Capitol, in which police officers participated. So that blind spot, I'm sure there are many in law enforcement who don't like what I say, don't like me being public about it. But as far as pushback, it's not really, you know, I'd welcome any pushback if I'm wrong.
Please join me in thanking Mike German for his work and his time